Hi, everybody. Looks like folks are slowly joining the room. We're just going to give it another 30 seconds or so to let everybody join. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar today. Hello, hello to those of you who just joined us. We're just giving it a few more seconds to let folks join the room. All right, it looks like it's slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. But good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're coming to us from today. Thank you for joining us for the Adolescent Sexting, Prevalence, Prevention, and Harm Reduction webinar hosted by HCET with presenter Dr. Debby Herbenick. My name is Jordan Murch. I am the Training and Community Engagement Manager at HCET, and I will be moderating the webinar today. I would like to briefly introduce you to healthcare education and training before we begin. HCET's mission is to provide comprehensive program development, education, and training to improve reproductive and sexual health outcomes. We are an organization of passionate people who are proactive in our belief that access to evidence-based, medically accurate reproductive and sexual health education, training, and care is a fundamental right. Next slide, please. This webinar does have closed captions available, so to enable them on your screen, you'll click Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen, then click Show Subtitles, and then you can change those settings by clicking Subtitle Settings. Next slide. Throughout the presentation, we do encourage you to send your questions via the Q&A box. So to submit a question, you'll hover over the main screen, then select the Q&A icon at the bottom. Once selected, the Q&A box should appear. And then to send a question at any time during the presentation, please send it through this Q&A box. It ensures that everyone in the webinar can view your question. And you can also send questions anonymously if you would like. And we will hold all questions until the end of the presentation. Next slide, thank you. Please be sure to follow us on our various social media accounts to keep up to date with the newest information and events. And now I will quickly review some housekeeping information. So a link to complete the event evaluation will be sent to you in the chat as well as via email following this webinar. Your feedback is greatly appreciated, so please fill that out for us at the end. Archived presentations and a list of upcoming events can be viewed on our website. And if you experience any technical difficulties during this presentation, please contact updates@hcet.org. And now I would like to introduce you to your presenter for today. For more than 20 years, Dr. Debby Herbenick's research has focused on understanding how people experience their bodies and sexual lives. Her research has addressed women's sexual pleasure and masturbation, vibrator use, couples communication, consensual non-monogamy, diverse sexual behaviors, condom use, sexual satisfaction, and sexually explicit media use. An award-winning researcher and educator, Dr. Herbenick is internationally known for her creative ways of sharing sexual science with the general public. She has written 5 best-selling books about sex and several thousand newspaper and magazine columns, served as co-producer for the Emmy-nominated documentary Hot Girls Wanted, and consulted on sexuality topics for various films and television shows. She has appeared on various television, radio, and web-based video series talking about sex and sex research. She is also the founder and host of the Bloomington Sex Salon, a popular event series dedicated to creating campus community conversations about sexuality topics. And without further ado, I will be turning things over to Dr. Debby Herbenick. Thank you. It looks good, but it looks like you're muted. There you go.
There we go. So it's so great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm Debby Herbenick. I'm a professor at Indiana University School of Public Health, and I have been researching sexuality for more than 20 years. And a portion of my research does relate to adolescent sexual behavior specifically, as well as adolescent sexting behaviors. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about a topic that I care a lot about. I've taught undergraduate and graduate sexuality courses since 2003, and I've provided sexuality education across the lifespan. So, talks for very young children about their bodies and, body safety, talks for fourth and fifth and sixth graders about puberty, and also talks with people about, sexuality and changes in advanced age and everything in between. I'm also a parent of two, and so I think a lot about topics that are important to young people, whether they're my own young people or young people in the community, because of course, what happens to, some subset of our kids really affects all of us. And I get asked a lot of questions at birthday parties and school drop-offs, and always feel like I'm having a lot of fun talking about these issues, and sometimes a lot of heartbreak talking about them. There's a lot of really difficult things that happen, but that's why it's important that we talk about these issues rather than brush them aside. So thank you again for having me. So today I have the following objectives in terms of discussing adolescent sexting. That in today's session, by the end of it, attendees will be able to describe the prevalence of sending and receiving so-called sexts among adolescents, be able to identify at least 2 reasons that adolescents and young adults engage in sexting, and 3, describe potential harm reduction approaches to adolescent sexting. So first of all, what is sexting? Because that term, of course, is an invented term. It's a term that is used very commonly in the media among people of all ages, among friends, but it means different things to different people. So it certainly can involve the exchange of messages, so sexy messages, people describing fantasies and sexual likes and dislikes and so on. It can also involve the sharing of sexual images. And very often when people talk about adolescent sexting or young adult sexting, they're really focusing on the images, because the images and the sharing, and especially the resharing, with or without permission, can have some of the biggest social and legal consequences, far more so than messages, although certainly sharing messages can as well. So a lot of the data that we'll be talking about today and some of the consequences are specific to images, but again, that doesn't mean that sharing of verbal messages doesn't have weight for young people, because it certainly can, especially socially. So sexting may be consensual, it may be non-consensual, or it also may be coerced or pressured. And we'll talk about some of these differences throughout today's talks as well. Non-consensual sexting, to be clear, may involve receiving unwanted or unsolicited messages. Some of the most common ways that this is often discussed in mainstream media and among adult friends and adolescents as well is the the possibility of receiving so-called dick pics, right? So often people sending pictures of their penis, but people can, without being asked for it, without somebody saying, please send that to me, or I'd like to see that, or expressing any kind of interest, just somebody sending them without permission, which can be a form of harassment as well. But it can be other types of images as well. Those are just the ones that we hear about with the most attention. But it can also involve the sharing of one's own images without permission. So somebody sending any type of nude or near nude or sort of sexual in some way image of themselves and having that reshared. Non-consensual sexting can involve pictures that were taken non-consensually or videos that were taken non-consensually and that were then shared among others as well. And sometimes we see that in our communities, even with people taking, pictures or video non-consensually in locker rooms, for example, and then sharing amongst other people. So there are lots of ways that non-consensual image sharing can occur. So why is sexting and image sharing a concern? Well, first of all, sexting may include the sharing of images, which could be pictures or videos that meet the legal definitions of child sexual exploitation materials, which are still sometimes called child pornography in some places. Many of us are less often using the term child pornography. Some of you maybe too, because the word or the phrase child pornography suggests, a focus on how people are using it rather than the abusive aspects of it or the exploitive aspects of it. So we're more often seeing terms like child sexual abuse images or child sexual exploitation materials. So sharing such images, even among peers, so even 14-year-old to 14-year-old or 16-year-old to 17-year-old, and even with consent or permission, may place young people at risk of legal problems as well as school suspension or expulsion. So some of the work that I've done has worked with a number of attorneys throughout the United States who see these types of cases all the time, who see fifth graders, sixth graders, eighth graders, high school students who sometimes are sharing pictures with each other as jokes. Sometimes they are sharing images with each other in flirtatious ways or as part of their sexual behavior relationships. But if those pictures are found or reshared, people can absolutely, take this down a path where they might wind up in juvenile detention, for example. In some states, these young people may wind up on sex offender lists. So depending on where somebody lives, the consequences can differ vastly. There are some states, not many, I think we're at 2 right now, that have decriminalized adolescent sexting. And to be clear, that is between teenagers of certain ages. It's not for everybody, and it's only when consensual. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But I do want to, pose that as a primary concern for many young people and their families, because even though it is not the most common outcome and it doesn't happen often, it really does happen. And it affects many young people in very serious ways. Another reason it's a concern is simply that some digital images really do live online indefinitely, or people just don't know if they're living online indefinitely. Some young people describe just feeling the stress and anxiety of not knowing what's happened to their image or who's seen their image, or if it might resurface at a later time. So especially for young people who perhaps are more vulnerable to stress or anxiety, even the consensual taking or sharing them can sometimes be a stressful experience for them. Sexting can also place young people at risk of harassment and bullying. This is more often experienced by girls and LGBTQ kids. Some research shows, for example, that while certainly some people can shrug it off when their pictures are non-consensually shared with others, others, are really teased ruthlessly, and that may result in depression or anxiety or even, really thinking about ending their own lives. So it can have very serious consequences socially for people and in terms of their health. There's also the potential for their images getting into the hands of others who would use them in bad ways. So for example, image-based sexual abuse or IBSA. Some people call this revenge porn. Again, that term is, folks are encouraging that we don't use that term anymore because again, it centers how people are using it. And it also suggests that there was something consensual about this because pornography, when it's done the way it's supposed to be done, is with consenting adults. And so the idea of revenge porn is really somebody taking somebody else's image and then using it against them. That may be by printing it out and posting it around a school. It may be printing it out and posting it around a town. It can be uploading it to a social media site. Some people call such sites slut pages, where they will collect a number of images, usually of girls or women who have, sent their pictures to somebody, often somebody that they trusted. And then those pictures wind up in a shared site where dozens or hundreds or thousands of people may see them. Sexting can also place young people at the risk of exploitation, especially if their image, again, winds up in the wrong hands, and then people may pass it around or sell it. And of what is called sextortion, which is can include blackmailing, but it's where a peer or an adult uses the images that they already have. So they might get one image from somebody and then say, if you don't send me more, I'm going to show your brother or sister. I'm going to tell your parents. I'm going to post it around school. I'm going to upload it to a website. And so that does happen as well. And it's something that, although not highly prevalent, it does happen even to kids and even to adolescents. So how common is adolescent sexting? The best research, a recent meta-analysis from a few years ago, shows that about 15% of teenagers have sent a sext and around 27% of teenagers have received one. Developmentally, sexting tends to increase over time, so it is positively associated with age. And so by the time kids grow up into young adults, about half of young adults have sexted with images, not just messages at that point. And there's definitely a lot of this is image sharing with adolescents too that I'm showing you here. So learning how to make thoughtful and informed decisions about taking and sharing what we call nudes or near nudes or engaging in sexting it truly is an important life skill for today's youth, because young people just are on the internet, right? They are. Their schools may require them to have devices. Their schools may require them to use the internet for different school projects. So they live a large portion of their lives on the internet. The vast majority of adolescents have access to a smartphone and are internet connected regularly, every day, spending hours online. And so to not face this really puts young people in jeopardy if we don't really help them think through and understand the full landscape of sexting, and also learn from them about what they're seeing, because they have a lot of information to share with us. So some of the information that adolescents share with researchers and clinicians is why they engaged in it in the first place. And many of them are really positive reasons as far as they're concerned. They enjoy the flirtatious aspects. Sometimes they make mistakes. They may not plan to take or send images, but they may, just like many adults, get caught up in their own sexual arousal or excitement or feelings of intimacy and closeness, and decide to send somebody an image that maybe they wouldn't have if they hadn't been feeling so excited and aroused. So that is a common experience that people have to navigate around their own sexual feelings as well. For some, it's a sign of trust. They feel like when you get to that level, you're kind of taking the relationship to a bigger place and you're solidifying it in some way. They may feel that it makes their relationship more official. They may have a sense that, they wouldn't do this if it was somebody they didn't care about, or maybe the other person tells them that, whether or not it's true. So they may feel like it's the relationship that's strengthening in some way. And for some, it's a reflection of love. And whether or not love in adolescence looks the same as adulthood, it doesn't quite look the same, I think most people would say, but it's still love. And so young people feeling like the exchange of those images and being a part of intimacy is also part of their experience of love is also another reason why young people sometimes say that they share images. It can also be pressured or coerced. And one thing that, some psychologists point out is that if we think about the upstream behavior, one major reason why young people, and especially young girls, share images is simply because they were asked to. And not just once, but often asked repeatedly and repeatedly, and, kind of made to feel guilty or like they weren't sexy or adventurous or mature enough to reach that stage where they would send images. So we'll talk more about that as well, and how important that ask can be in terms of prevention as well. I love this quote from Dr. Jeffrey Temple, who's a professor and also a psychologist at the University of Texas Medical Branch. And a few years ago, when this really important paper came out in pediatrics about sexting, he was giving some quotes to some media sources. And one of them was this, which is, it's a fairly normative behavior, and he's referring to sexting here. It doesn't mean your kid is deviant or in a life of crime. It means they're interested in their sexuality and sex, right? So kind of reminding parents and those who support youth that we can also find our calm in a sense when we realize that a young person may have engaged in sexting, and reframe it in the sense of what it means about their development. So how do young people engage in sexting? Certainly text messaging remains a major source of sharing the images, but so is messaging via assortment of apps. And some of these are the standard social media apps like Instagram or Snapchat or Twitter. Some of them are encrypted apps where things, that are not easily traced. So Signal and Discord are some types of apps that, do and don't involve encryption that young people might also use. So there's dozens of ways to share images. One way that young people also share images is through the use of secondary accounts or fake accounts on Instagram. You may have heard these called like the Finstas, the FINSTAs. And so being aware of that, there was a new study that came out just a few months ago showing that for young people that the use of secondary accounts was, or just having a secondary account was associated with a greater likelihood of engaging in nude or near nude image sharing. And this same study was also the first study where we've seen younger kid data. So it also included data from 9 to 12-year-olds and showed that 12% of 9 to 12-year-olds and about a third of 13 to 17-year-olds had a secondary or fake account. And more than a quarter of these young people have been using encrypted accounts. So the messaging may be happening one-on-one. It also can be happening in group texts or blasts, and especially for the resharing without permission. So sometimes, certainly if somebody's looking to shame somebody or they think it's funny, they may be looking to send somebody's image out to a large number of people. Again, images may be shared online or offline, though, and it can happen with or without permission. In terms of the non-consensual sharing of images, about 12% of teenagers indicate in surveys that they've forwarded a nude image without permission from the person depicted. Many of them don't necessarily mean any harm, but some do. Some are looking to shame or to hurt somebody's reputation. In the same study, it showed that about 9% of 9 to 12-year-olds have also forwarded or reshared a nude or near nude image of somebody without permission from the person who is depicted. So this is not rare. It's not highly prevalent, but it's not rare. And it's something that everybody who's working with and supporting youth needs to understand. Males are more likely to non-consensually share images of others. High school boys are also more likely to perpetrate sextortion than girls. So again, that idea of, you've already sent me one. If you don't send me more, I'm going to, tell your family or tell your friends or share it widely. Girls are also more likely to be victims of sextortion than boys, and less is known about sextortion among gender minoritized youth. So I think experts generally are in agreement that it's likely a vulnerable group for a number of reasons, including specifically issues around gender and genitals and so on. In a US nationally representative survey of middle school and high school students, 5% of them indicated that they had experienced sextortion already, and 3% admitted to using an image that somebody had shared with them to threaten them in some way. So again, like kind of perpetrating acts of sextortion. Image sharing was associated, as I mentioned earlier, with the use of secondary accounts and also encrypted accounts. And in that sense, it's not clear if just having the accounts is what's facilitating it, or if it's the sense that people who, of course, want to be sharing seek out accounts like that so that they can do that. So how can professionals support youth, families, and communities? For those working directly with tweens and teens, or who are parents as well, discussing the taking or sharing of nudes or near nudes or sexting. Again, people will use lots of words and lots of different words to discuss this as part of more general conversations around digital safety and healthy relationships. So for example, talking about how asking to take an image or share an image of somebody, we're talking even non-sexual images too, just taking people's pictures is part of healthy relationship patterns. And that resharing people's pictures, like posting them on social media without talking about them, might be something that, could be a red flag or something that you might want to talk about. Or if a friend does that and you don't like that, you would be able to say, oh, hey, next time, could you ask me before posting a picture of me? So really kind of setting these up as early skills around media and around healthy relationships as well. Also describing the potential effects to young people on their mood, stress, anxiety, bullying, and harassment of taking and sharing these images. Again, I've had some college students even who have talked about completely consensually taking images of themselves, nude or nearly nude, or sexual images of themselves, sharing them voluntarily, but then wondering later on, especially if a relationship ended, what did that person do with my image? Or what happens if their phone is stolen or their laptop is stolen? And so, especially if somebody is really prone to stress or anxiety, there can be young people, and again, this happens to adults too, who may have enjoyed it in the moment, thought it was fine at the moment, thought it was fine with a particular person until they got in a fight with that person, or until they woke up in the middle of the night thinking, yeah, what would happen if we broke up, or if they lost their phone, or feeling that stressing or anxiety if they really do lose their own phone or their partner loses their phone. And then you wonder what happens to my image. And so really like kind of walking young people through the scenarios of, well, what would it feel like? And how would somebody else feel if they had their image, shared, so that you're also helping them to plan ahead for instances where they may find themselves around friends or peers who are joking about somebody's image or talking about sending it or saying, oh, can you believe that person took that image? Let me see it, or share it around. And so that they might even be able to be a good bystander and say, no, I shouldn't be seeing that, and nobody else should be seeing that. That was a private picture. You can also share with tweens and teens the potential legal and school ramifications. So many schools, middle schools, and high schools certainly have policies. Some elementary schools now have policies too, related to the taking or sharing of nude images. There can be extra layers to this, especially if the sharing occurs on school grounds, where, not surprisingly, the phones, the images, the devices may wind up in the hands of the principal and other administrators, and then the police, and a number of parties who then get involved in those proceedings. And so really helping them understand that. When these images get passed around and then an adult finds them, an adult, especially authority figure, finds them, they really may be seen by dozens and dozens and dozens of adult strangers, attorneys and judges and juries, and, in some cases, and they may be seen by, expert witnesses and paralegals, and just sort of all sorts of people involved in these cases that young people generally aren't thinking about, may potentially see their images. They may not understand, that their school has certain policies. They may think it's just between friends, or it's just between partners, or we're all young, we're kids, what does it matter? But these school policies really do have important implications for what could happen to them if they've taken or shared images, especially if it's done non-consensually. Sometimes the consequences are more severe for non-consensual sharing. There's also the general advice not to shame young people for engaging in sexting. Even though many adults caution against it, it is true, as we've seen, that many young people will engage in it anyway. Even if they don't initially plan to, they might get caught up in the moment. And so trying not to shame them, and being a really open source of information and support, so that they do know that they can come to a trusted parent or caregiver or provider if they really need some help in a difficult situation. And asking them to immediately let parents or other trusted adults or providers know if adults are asking them for nudes or other sexy images, or if they're being pressured or asked for any such images by a peer. And also to share that they should delete nudes or near nudes if they receive them. And so even holding on to images, again, from a child, from a minor, does have really important legal ramifications in most US states. And so it's illegal to possess, right, these sexual images of minors, and they need to know that. So how do we support parents as well? If you're wondering what these yellow chairs are, I too was wondering what they were when I looked at my phone from a recent vacation. And as I mentioned, I'm a parent. So for those of you who are parents of young kids, or have been parents of young kids during a time of smartphones, you'll know that even if you don't willingly turn over your phone to your kids, that sometimes if you get for a moment, as I did, to go inside this cafe and get an iced tea, that your child may start taking pictures. And so I had, seen and looking back over some vacation photos, suddenly thought, what are all these pictures? And there were just, a dozen pictures from the couple of minutes I had gone inside to get some tea, and of the floor, and of the sidewalk, and of people's feet, and, and houses, and all sorts of things like that. And it's just a good reminder to me when I find these on my phone, as I occasionally do, and as many of my friends occasionally do, that young people are using phones from early ages. And that actually gives us lots of opportunities to talk about digital safety and healthy relationships and good media skills at early ages. So first, encourage parents to build a foundation at very young ages. And again, if we can take the sex out of it and just think about image taking and sharing for a minute, start early with key messages and look for teachable moments, even in this great kids series Bluey, which many of you may be familiar with. It comes out of Australia. It's like a PBS type of show from Australia with these cute little, dog cartoon characters. And in a recent episode called Born Yesterday, which is worth checking out if you haven't seen it, the mom who's over there, her name is Chili, she's on the right, she's doing yoga. And her two daughters, Bluey and Bingo, come and they're playing a game and they start saying, oh, like they start taking pictures of their mom's butt. She's like, no, you don't take pictures of people's butts. And then the dad comes in the room a minute later and they kind of talk about that with him. They want him to, I think bend over or do something like that or turn around. And he's like, no, I wasn't born yesterday, which is how it comes. And he's like, I don't, he knows what they're up to. Right. But it's a very brief part of this episode, but it is a reminder for parents that they should probably tell their kids even at young ages, right? We don't take pictures of people without clothes on. We don't take or send pictures of people's nude breasts or their vulvas or their penises or their butts. And even with clothes on, right? You shouldn't go around taking pictures of people's butts on them. There have been, again, adolescents and young adults who have faced disciplinary action for going around and taking pictures of people clothes of their butts with clothes on, because it can be a form of harassment as well. And so these key messages about like, ask somebody before you take a picture of them, ask somebody before you share a picture of them in any way. And, laying the foundation, if you're doing this at very young ages that have nothing to do with sexuality, but laying the foundation for later age and developmentally appropriate talks about digital priving and sexting. This is really important, and it also gets tricky because it's not always how parents are used to acting, because of course you don't ask for consent for taking pictures from babies and so on, but you have to learn that at some point if you're a parent who's trying to model the behavior that you wish to see. So parents, that also means if they're going to be asking kids to ask before taking and sharing pictures, that's a practice they may want to start inhabiting themselves as well. So, saying, oh, I'd love to share this picture with your grandparents. Can I text it to them? Most of the time a kid may say, sure. But for various reasons, a kid may say, no, I'd just like to keep that private, or like, no, thanks, don't send that to grandma today. And that's fine, right? So teaching kids that they're in charge of or over their own images is a great early message to share with them. Letting them know that they get a say over who sees their pictures is like a really good thing to build in them at young ages, so that as they get to be older kids and teenagers, that they may really have a sense that, my pictures belong to me. And then if you have exceptions and your kids are really good at spotting exceptions, then those are good to think through, well, what makes this different? So for example, if you have rules about not taking naked pictures, well, what happens if you see something cute in the bath and you want to take a picture? Do you do it anyway? And if so, how do you explain that to a child? Or do you say, as cute as that is, I'm just going to enjoy the moment here and not take a picture of it. So these are things that families have to work through. I'll share that even in my own family, we do this of, asking people before we take pictures of them. But then a different situation came up where, we were at a soccer game and took, a video of a soccer goal. And later on, showing my child and them saying, there's a lot of people there. Did you ask everyone on the field? I said, oh, goodness, I didn't, and we did have a good conversation about some of these public games and people's expectations around, pictures and videos, but it was also a good teachable moment for me as a parent and as an educator about the different scenarios and how important that is to discuss, with kids when there are exceptions. And also when family members need to own their mistakes, right? If a kid says, wait, you're taking a picture of me and you didn't ask, instead of brushing it aside or being dismissive of them, saying, you're right. Like, I should have asked. We've talked about that in our family and I should have asked. Is it all right with you? Would you like me to keep the image or delete it? But again, coming back to core principles of consent around picture taking and sharing. So what about parents of tweens and teens? And this is really right, the age groups that we're thinking about and talking about today. So making sure we've seen the data, even in the 9 to 12-year-olds, it's not just the 13 and up. So making sure, especially if kids have any access to devices, so smartphones, iPads, tablets, other sorts of devices, any device that has camera enabled on it. And when I say access, I don't just mean their own device. I mean devices that their friends may have, and when they're at a play date or a sleepover, or at school, or that they may be at when they're, playing with their cousins and so on. So making sure that they understand not just basic rules about image taking and sharing, but also that there are different kinds of sexting. I mean, you really have to start talking about nude and near nude image. You don't have to use the term sexting, but at these ages, many of them will start to hear, even as older kids, they'll start to hear that term. So introducing that term in your family's context so that they understand what it means if somebody were to say, to send me a sext, can be helpful to hear from somebody who they love and trust, and before they hear it from a peer. So starting to talk about the consensual aspects, the non-consensual aspects, and also pressure and coercion. And sharing that a good form of prevention is not just don't take a picture like this, don't take a nude picture, but also don't ask anyone for a nude picture. Lisa D'Amour, who's a psychologist, she writes fabulous books around adolescence. She, I think, has been really helpful around trying to shift this conversation around don't just focus on like the people who are taking, which often frankly blames a lot of the young girls, as she points out. But let's also talk about the don't ask, and letting young people know that sexting, or letting the parents of young people know that sexting is somewhat common. It's not highly prevalent, but it doesn't mean anything bad about young people, right? Again, they're not horrible. This is still developmentally a typical behavior. And that they should consider a more instructive approach. So a warm parenting approach that gives information about the possible school and legal ramifications, that talks to them, encourages young people to think about the social consequences as well, but that doesn't seek to shame them or to be overly restrictive with tons of, highly restrictive parent-directed rules, and instead coming up with rules together as a family where you're really co-creating rules around technology. But they really do need to talk about what could happen. And just like Bluey offers teachable moments for young kids, for kids who are of an old enough age where they might be watching a show like Ted Lasso, as some of you may know, there was a recent episode that spoke pretty directly about sexting and about, well, what happens with images and who should, share them and who should keep them and when do you delete them? So those are great conversation starters for probably more like older teenagers and parents to have. So professionals can also advise parents to talk with their kids about technology, again, to be transparent and collaborative with their kids about what rules might look like in their family, whether parents will perform spot checks on their kids' technology use or even use digital monitoring apps. Some of you may have heard of Bark or other apps where they might get alerts about their child's online behavior. But generally the advice is to, only monitor kids' online behavior or do spot checks if their child is aware, because otherwise it's a violation of trust. But if you can work together to co-create rules, not only does it help kids feel trusted, but it also grows their skills, because again, they will need their skills, to figure this out on their own, because we can't always be there to help them make those decisions. And finally, in this space, it's important for parents not to treat sexting as so terrible that a child might feel like there's no way out if they do end up sexting, if they do end up taking an image, sharing it with others, or somebody else taking an image of them with or without their permission. Kids need to know that they can go to their parents or other trusted adults for support. Because otherwise it may make them more vulnerable to sextortion. There's a real difference between somebody, a scenario where somebody says, if you don't send me more pictures, I'm going to tell your family. There's a real difference with a kid who says, I can go to my parents and they'll help me, versus, oh no, like what if they tell my family, right? And then they may feel more pressured to send more pictures. In terms of professional interactions with policymakers, There's this great article that came out a few years ago in 2019. There's the source in the journal Pediatrics. And there's a number of professional recommendations for those working with tweens and teens, for policymakers, and we'll get to some of the other recommendations here as well. But specifically around policy, they encouraged professionals to advocate for policy changes that decriminalize consensual sexting between adolescents and to work with policymakers on laws that penalize adult child sexting, revenge porn, and misuse of potentially harmful forms of sexting, coerced and non-consensual forms. So again, like right now, most states have not decriminalized consensual sexting between adolescents, but where possible, I think that's a real move forward. This is consistent with the overall idea that many professionals in the space have, that consensual, non-coerced, non-pressure, but truly consensual sexting between adolescent peers, so teen to teen, should be viewed as a health and education issue rather than a law enforcement issue. So still, issues around prevention and harm reduction, but not one that, automatically puts them into the criminal justice system. In terms of working with schools and communities, professionals can encourage schools and communities to include evidence-based programs on sexting and digital citizenship into curricula that address ethics, sexual harassment, anti-bullying, healthy relationships, and or sexuality education. So there's lots of places you can put that information, and depending on what exists in a school or what types of in-service opportunities are available for faculty and staff, or that might be available for parent education or for kids directly, there's lots of opportunities. And towards the end of this talk, I have a resource for a recent article that lists a number of evidence-based programs. Professionals can also encourage schools to review their policy on sexting. So again, getting back to Lisa Damour's idea is, does the policy address the person asking for the images or just the ones who are taking the images? As you'll find out, many schools really do just focus on the idea of taking or sharing images. But if the policy actually includes asking kids not to ask for images in the first place, what that allows kids to do is, if they get a text or a message that is asking for a nude, nearly nude, or sexual kind of image, they can screenshot that, right? And they can take that to their teacher or the principal and say, hey, this person is asking me for these things. Can you tell them to cut it out? So addressing that ask in the first place may be an important piece of prevention. Now, in terms of harm reduction, this is a controversial area. I mean, some people say, no, look, this is, flat out illegal in most states. Even when some states have diversionary programs, which many do, where teenagers can be educated rather than become on a sex offender list. There's still just a lot of variation in how states manage adolescent sexting cases, again, even consensual ones. And so some people aren't ready yet to move into a harm reduction space, but some people are. I was in a meeting yesterday where somebody who works a lot with youth in our community was saying, this is really what young people need. There's this book that came out this year called Behind Their Screens, What Teens Are Facing and Adults Are Missing, written by Emily Weinstein and Carrie James. They're two Harvard researchers who have done a lot of direct work with youth about their digital lives. And so some of these come from their book, others from other sources, including research studies that I've done. But young people are already doing a lot of harm reduction on their own. And some of them are looking for more support from the people, the people in their lives, the adults in their lives who might help them think through some of this too. Because for some of them, they do feel a bit alone on it. So it can help to ask teens and young adults how they respond to the pressure to send or share an image. Sometimes older siblings, like young adult siblings, are really great sources of information for younger teens in the same family who are trying to navigate this, right? Maybe a 17 or 19-year-old older sister or brother says, look, here's how you manage this when this happens. Some young people respond in humorous ways to deflect when they're asked to send pictures. Like somebody asks them to send dirty pictures, they send a picture of muddy boots. I mean, it's just, people are going to do what they do, and some people respond with humor. Some just ignore. Some do choose to send some type of nude, nearly nude or sexual kind of image, but they actually send images of other people. Now, on the one hand, they may be thinking, well, they're not my images, so, I don't have the concern about my image getting leaked online. But it's really important to get young people to think about, wait, you're still disseminating nude or nearly nude images of other people. And especially if you don't know who that person is, and they could be a minor, then you're still disseminating potentially images of minors, and you're still disseminating nude images to other minors. And so this is a problem. So some of their harm reduction strategies may be all right, but some are not. And you need to kind of, or it helps to talk it through with them. Some do, again, choose to send some type of image of themselves, but they watermark it in a way that they see that if this image is shared, now they know essentially who shared it, and when this image was taken and how old they were at the time and what it is that person shared. So some kind of create this tracking system. Others do, again, make the choice to send, but they do their best to leave out identifying details like birthmarks or their face. They don't put their face or head in it, or piercings or so on. And some people are better about thinking about this than others. Some young people are quite good at taking out all identifying materials, but again, they're still sending images of, if they're a minor, of minors to other minors, or potentially other adults if they have an older partner. And so they still have to know about social and legal consequences. But also some don't always realize the types of identifying materials that could be there, or other things that might identify them. For example, if they're using a secondary or fake account, sometimes adults who are looking to exploit young people might still be able to figure things out. Like they might see enough of their other posts to figure out what school they go to based on like school colors and other photos. Or they might notice that most of their followers all go to the same kind of school, or a lot of them go to a certain school, so they can figure things out. So there's not always as much safety or privacy as young people expect. And so even sharing some sexual images online that they think have had identifying details left out, sometimes they can use some support in figuring that out. And when bullying, shaming, and harassment occurs, again, some focus are on shifting the blame. So trying to create a culture where when this does happen, sometimes images are reshared without permission around schools, instead of, hearing things and passing around language like, can you believe they took that picture of themselves, or what a slut. Some young people are really proactive about trying to shift the blame to the person who sent it without permission, right? Who was resharing it. So, well, it was wrong of that person to share it without my permission or without their permission. So away from blaming the victim, to try to minimize some of the social harm. So overall, the sort of most recent viewpoints you'll see in the literature around adolescent sexting and supporting young people are acknowledging that adolescent sexting often reflects developmentally typical interest in bodies, sex, and sexuality. Encourages adults not to shame young people who engage in consensual sexting, and to be sources of support, and to let them know that even if you've said, I don't think you should do this, I don't advise it, here are all the things that can go wrong, you can still come to me, if this is what you choose to do and you need some help, and I'll help you figure it out. Educating them about the potential social and legal consequences, as well as the fact that many employers and schools search for students' online presentation and sort of, what do their profiles look like? I was at a recent talk where somebody was sharing some preliminary data suggesting that the potential for future employers may actually be, for some subset of young people, more of a deterrent than just thinking about social consequences or legal consequences, because they often don't know anyone, right, that has actually had real legal consequences for sexting, but they may think, oh yeah, maybe I have heard of somebody who couldn't get into the school that they wanted to, or their employer had been on their Facebook or their Twitter or their Instagram or whatever. And avoiding scare tactics, which typically don't work. There is some research that the parenting style really matters. And again, that warm, instructive parenting style is more helpful at deterring adolescent sexting than the overly restrictive parenting or authoritarian style. And engaging with this issue in schools, especially given the potential impact on the school environment, because when these images do get shared, they are disruptive to the learning environment, right? They are disruptive to kids' mental health. Even if you're not the one whose image was shared, seeing somebody else go through that may also make you worry, well, what if my image gets out there? And so it can cause a lot of disruption in schools and be really harmful for kids if we're not really paying attention to this issue and helping young people through it. So finally, a few resources. The Behind Their Screens book, which I think is really terrific at hearing directly in terms of young, directly the voices of young people who talk about their media environments, their use of devices, their experiences with adolescent sexting. Some completely neutral or positive experiences, some pretty negative experiences, and how they find their way around it. I have a book coming out this fall, which a lot of this information and advice comes from. There's an entire book on sex or entire chapter on sex and technology and aspects on sexting specifically. It's for parents, called Yes, Your Kid: What Parents Need to Know About Today's Teens and Sex. And also The Emotional Lives of Teenagers is Dr. Lisa Damour's latest, although I also really like Under Pressure and Untangled. But it's this book, Emotional Lives of Teenagers, that deals a little bit more with some issues around sexual harassment and also specifically some issues around sexting. In terms of the article resources that I have on the right, the top one, if you're looking for some information specifically for professionals and clinicians and recommendations, again, for policy, for schools, community, for parents, for working directly with tweens and teens, that pediatrics article is a great place to go. The second one, a relatively recent article in Archives of Sexual Behavior, is a terrific resources for evidence-based programs around the world, actually related to sexting prevention and intervention. And then the third one is also a recent article from Michael Cito, who does a lot of great research on sexual offending, especially internet related. And he has a couple papers. This one is the youth-focused one that has kids in the 9 to 12 age group and also the 13 to 17-year-old age group. So really impactful data on sexting behaviors and the secondary accounts use of the young people, and also some adolescent use behavior there as well. And he has another paper that came out too from the same data set that looks at parents. So I hope that these resources will be helpful to you, and I'm happy to take some questions too. Thank you. Okay, I see that there's a question that says, is there any data around if sexting can delay the initiation of physical sex between youth? That's a good question. I can't think of any data specifically around delaying the initiation of physical sex. There is data showing that it often co-occurs, right? So that sexting behaviors often co-occur as relationships progress and people become more sexual offline as well. Can we get a direct link for the evidence-based curriculum? So it's that second article. I don't have a link to that specific article, but if you were to look at it, and this is what Jordan's going to do, put that in Google Scholar, she may be able to get a link for that, but it has a number of different curriculum for different age groups and even different curricula in different countries as well. And so near nude images can be, can be things like just some body parts, or can be, some of the breasts, but not all of the breasts, and so on. So they're showing some levels of nudity, but not like full breasts, for example, or full genitals. And I would say too that, so Michael Cito was a colleague, and when that paper came out, I was really interested to see it and sent him a note. But one of the things that it made me think about was some of the things I've seen in my own professional sphere, which is that I am hearing more now about really young kids sharing images as well. And when I say really young, so that age, that paper from Dr. Cito's paper went as low as age 9. And that was pretty novel data to have data from 9 to 12-year-olds. We didn't have that before. But I'm hearing professionally about, and just in networks I'm a part of kids sharing images at age 7, right? And age 6. And so, and it's really, most of what I'm hearing is just like play behavior between kids, where kind of like, I'll show you mine if you show me yours, instances where kids who may not have had devices if it weren't for the pandemic, but they may have been connected on Facebook Messenger or Marco Polo or other types of, image or video sharing apps with cousins, with friends, with neighbors, with grandparents, and they were only connected, right? Their parents took such great care to make sure they were only connected to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, really close, trusted people. But even, who does that kind of play happen with? It happens with close friends and siblings and cousins. And so there have been some cases I've heard about where parents have realized that unbeknownst to them, their 6, 7, 8-year-old had taken and shared pictures of chests, genitals, vulvas, penises, butts, and sent them to a friend or sent them to a cousin, and using those types of apps. And so I mentioned that because when Dr. Cito's paper came out, I did say in the general sexual behavior research, especially with adults, we often deal with the problem of recall, right? I mean, how well do people sometimes remember sexual events that happened 10 or 20 or 30 years earlier? And I said, wow, it's starting to occur to me that we may now be in a case where even when we ask kids about their sharing of nude or partially nude images, that some of them may not remember actually some of the image sharing that they engaged in. And so there will probably be some time where some of the accurate data, we need some of the more reliable data to get for younger kids is probably going to need to come from parents. But we don't really have good data on that youngest sharing, but it does happen. And even though it doesn't have the same, it doesn't have all the same consequences, it does have some, right? There is still that concern about images getting out there, getting in the wrong hands, and what may happen to those.
Thank you so much. I did have one question sent to me as well. It is, are there any legal ramifications for teens who send sexually explicit texts that don't necessarily include pictures?
So in terms of legal, and I'm not an attorney, just to be clear. So in terms of my understanding of the law, which again is pretty limited to the cases I've been a part of and the things that I've read in the literature, is I'm not aware of only the messages, right? As long as they're not threatening in some way. I mean, if somebody's certainly threatening assault or rape, that gets into different territory, or if they're harassing somebody. So certainly verbal messages that are persistent, unwanted, there would be some potential ramifications there. But, young people are also not often aware of how, how their texts, even their message-based texts, may be perceived later on. And so if something later on happens where somebody says this person's been harassing me, or they assaulted me, or they asked for this thing to happen, or they told me they wanted this thing to happen, I will say, from having been a part of, some cases, is that all of those texts can be recovered, right? In many cases, not always, but texts can often be recovered. They get produced, and again, lots of people see those texts. So more often, I think, when we're just thinking about general sexting as messages, more of like the non-harassing kinds, the non-violent kinds, more often I hear about social ramifications of somebody talking about something sexual that they like or want done to them, and that gets passed around or screenshotted and shared. And that's used certainly in shaming and bullying and harassing ways as well.
Thank you. It doesn't look like we have any other questions in the Q&A, but I did want to let folks know if anyone wants to ask a question verbally. If you raise your hand, I am able to unmute you. So that is an option as well. But we can give it a few more seconds if folks are brainstorming questions. And in the meantime, I'll go ahead and put the evaluation link in the chat. If you could fill that out for us, we would greatly appreciate it. And I will send this link as well as the PowerPoint slides via email following the webinar too.
Thank you. And in terms of the schools, I would also say for anyone who wants to learn more about their school policies, right? The handbooks are often online. Talking with the school board about what their policies are and what feels right for that community. How the policies around image sharing get developed can be a helpful step for anyone who's wanting to explore that as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm not seeing any hands or any other questions, but thank you so much, Dr. Herbenick. It looks like someone's saying, I wish this was longer. I agree. This is very interesting. So thank you so much. And yeah, we can give you folks a few extra minutes back in your day. I will follow up in an email, and it looked like you provided your contact information if anyone thinks of any questions later. But thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much, Dr. Herbenick, and I will follow up with you in an email as well.
Thank you all. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks.